Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. He once threatened to bomb North Korea, but over the weekend, the US president and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made history. Donald Trump became the first US president to step over the military demarcation line between the two Koreas. The DMZ was created as a buffer after the 1950-53 Korean War, and it was jointly overseen by the US-led United Nations Command and North Korea. It appears President Trump has come a long way from calling the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as Little Rocket Man. What was expected to be brief handshakes and a quick hello and a photo op turned into at least a 66-minute meeting between the two, indoors and outdoors. So Mr. Trump made his audacious offer to meet Mr. Kim at the DMZ while heading to South Korea after attending the Group 20 summit in Japan. So was this meeting between the two an actual step towards progress or a political theater in light of rising tensions over the issue of North Korea's denuclearization? We will be talking about this with our guests and more. So without further ado, let me introduce who we have with us today. From Sydney, we are joined by international relations expert Dr. Leonid Petrov. And in London, we have Professor Christian Kaunert, a US security expert who is with us today. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Let me start with you, Dr. Leonid. We're talking about, once again, President Trump showing how foreign policy for him is as variant and oscillating as a pendulum. What do you make of this latest development? Do you think it was political theater or there's more to what happened on the screens?
Well, such things happen in politics, but this was probably one of the most dramatic turnarounds. Within 18 months, President Trump completely changed his attitude from fury and fire rhetoric to bromance and exchange of letters, handshakes and smiles. With leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, I think he's demonstrated the consistency. North Korea always wanted three things from the United States. To be precise, it's the lifting of sanctions, a security assurance, and ideally diplomatic recognition. And, well, with Kim Jong-un's case, it's just continued to be the same until today. From Donald Trump's perspective, the relationship developed from zero to now full strength, full steam towards full denuclearization. We don't know whether it's going to be achieved or not, but obviously what was happening is just a major change of tactic from multilateral approach, which was pursued by all previous administrations in the United States, Obama administration, former George W. Bush administration, to bilateral relations, and it has worked well.
It has worked well. But what's your take on it, Professor Christian? Not once did President Trump mention the word denuclearization on Sunday. What do you make of his strategy?
Yes, I mean, in a sense, this surprises. This is classic Trump, if you like. He starts with a number of threats, kind of saying, look, you know, establishing I'm the big power here. You're going to comply with, you know, my demands. And then as soon as the other party is kind of coming around to it a little bit, Trump turns on his charm and kind of gives something that the other side wants. And I think this is clearly the case here in terms of North Korea. It shouldn't surprise us that it comes just after the tensions that were rising over Iran, because it's also a kind of a signal towards Iran. Look, you know, you play nice with me and there's something to be getting from me. But at the same time, it's also a clear signal towards North Korea that if you comply with my demands, there's something in it for you.
But it seems that there's a bit of a difference here in these parallels you've drawn between how it treats Iran, which also it's after for its denuclearization campaign, and at the same time, North Korea. It's almost as if Trump is more forgiving towards North Korea. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think we are at different stages in the discussions, if you like. Iran, as it happened, had an agreement with the United States and Europe, and Trump was the one who tore it into pieces. So, of course, Iran was not happy about that. So we're at a different stage in the process of negotiating with Iran.
Okay.
With Iran, we're a little bit more at the beginning of the threatening process and the threatening stage, if you like. Whereas with North Korea, if you remember, and as you rightly pointed out, at the beginning of his presidency, a similar approach was also applied to North Korea in terms of threatening, kind of, pointed out, potentially bombing North Korea. So I think we are just at a different stage, if you like, in his negotiating strategy. Whether it'll work or not, that is something that is still open. But it's certainly a relatively classic Trump negotiation strategy.
Right. So, Dr. Leonid, then this seems, as our guest says, classic strategy. But let's go a little back. Since February, since the failed Hanoi summit, there has been no progress. And North Korea has stalled essentially because it doesn't want to give up its nuclear arsenal. And for that, it's risked huge sanctions and it's really suffering in terms of economy. Why is it that their terms, to hang on to their arsenal, is so important to them that they risk isolation on a global community?
Well, first of all, North Korea has been under sanctions and fairly isolated among the community for the last 66 years since the armistice agreement was signed. And North Korea is subject to the trading with the Enemy Act of the United States and also numerous multilateral sanctions. But what was happening between Hanoi and Panmunjom? Well, President Trump mentioned that actually Hanoi was not a disaster. Hanoi was just a step, a stage in the negotiation process. He said that it was a necessary step. Sometimes you have to identify your positions and make it clear that something's not going to work, and then make another step, which is going to be more successful. So if we look at Hanoi as a necessary step in the right direction, and if we look at the Panmunjom summit, which was brief, rather symbolic, but still important step in coordinating positions. So I think that we can learn some lessons. First of all, in Hanoi, Kim Jong-un was insisting on lifting of sanctions, which didn't work for President Trump. And I think Kim Jong-un learned that lesson, and he was discussing the new strategy where it's not about sanctions, it's about diplomatic recognition and also the parity in the necessary steps, like an action for action, where North Koreans would respond and reciprocate to what Americans are prepared to do.
But see, there's where the problem is, isn't it, Dr. Leonid? Because it essentially is based on a quid pro quo and equal give and take between the two states. But North Korea, which originally had been for the NPT, the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, had eventually withdrawn for the same reason, that it wasn't fair that the nuclear-armed states could continue with their stockpiles, and there was no sort of timeline, there was no obligation, no threat of sanctions to get rid of them. So this is pretty much the same situation reflected here, an impasse.
Well, the impasse was created some 20 years ago, 19 years ago, when the Bush administration completely undid what the former Clinton administration was developing. So the framework agreement was completely thrown away, and North Koreans had to go ahead with their nuclear program and leave the expel international inspectors and continue developing this nuclear program already based on not only plutonium but also uranium material. So with President Trump, I think it's the new situation, but he is repeating the same mistakes. What President Bush did here, it was the ABC policy, everything but Clinton policy. So President Trump is doing everything but Obama administration policy, where he is on the one hand is scrapping the deal with Iran and giving a really bad example for North Korea. On the other hand, he is building relations with Kim Jong-un, and Iran is looking with amazement of what North Korea has been doing. Iran is not permitted, so it should just demonstrate the double standards.
Exactly, because
policy.
While Iran had complied with the JCPOA, allowing the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Commission officers to continuously investigate, giving them access and proving that they weren't building up nuclear weapon stockpiles, they're still getting the brunt of it. So here my question really is, Professor Christian, that what is it that Trump is trying to do here? Because trying to understand his policy, besides the fact that he is very unpredictable, it doesn't really make sense.
Yes, I mean, you're clearly going at the heart of the question here. When it comes to Iran, in a sense, we had a solution to the conflict. An agreement was there. The Europeans had accepted it. America had accepted. Obama had accepted it. So we basically had a solution to the problem. But it wasn't a solution that President Trump wants. It isn't just that it was a kind of Obama legacy agreement, but it goes deeper than that in the sense that it is a solution that to an extent does not prevent Iran from eventually gaining the nuclear bomb. So it is an agreement that delays the process rather than prevent it. And that was the main criticism that, of course, Trump had right from the beginning, even before the agreement. So what he's trying to do is to establish a situation where there's a complete denuclearization. So I guess that's why he didn't like the Iranian solution. And I think that is where he's trying to go with the North Koreans as well. Now, whether he's going to actually achieve that in the end is very, very questionable. I don't necessarily think we're going to get there, but I think that's the ambition and the objective.
But also, Professor, do you think then the sanctions that North Korea has been sort of wants the U.S. Is there any chances that President Trump might show some flexibility on those?
I mean, if he wants to remain credible, normally he shouldn't be able to remove those sanctions because we're very, very far away from those substantive steps that show that North Korea is really removing the possibility of it gaining the nuclear bomb if it doesn't have it already.
Especially considering here, and I'm going to pull you in, Dr. Leonid, on this question, especially considering that the issue with Iran was also the long-range missiles, the ballistic missiles. And here we've seen Kim Jong-un launch several ICBMs that are a direct threat to U.S. mainland.
Well, the difference between Iran and North Korea is that there's no South Iran. South Korea produces not only automobiles, laptops, and mobile phones. It's also the 13th largest economy in the world, and it has the significant influence on regional politics. And its president, Moon Jae-in, has been acting as a mediator in the relationship between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. So there was no actor on the international stage who would have taken this role of a mediator and peacemaker and bring together to the negotiating positions of the two arch enemies. And Panmunjom demonstrated the perfect setting for this, the divided Korea, the symbol of military confrontation. But still, the border is not only dividing, but it also serves as an interface for negotiations, for dialogue, cooperation, trade, and I think President Trump just did very well by finding an opportunity to meet with both North and South Korean leaders. It was not just Trump, Kim summit. It was a tripartite summit of which was the fulcrum of the Cold War, which we see still besets the Northeast Asian region. With Iran, with the Middle East, the dynamic is very different. It's also the hackneyed, relationship of mistrust. And I don't think that President Trump actually can easily navigate these stormy waters.
Okay. So then let me ask you this, Professor Christian. We just saw a few weeks ago how China's leader went and visited the North Korean leader. It was widely contemplated that this was also going to be a meeting related to get Kim Jong-un on the negotiating table again with the U.S. Do you think it had any kind of leverage, President Xi meeting Kim Jong-un recently?
Yes, of course. I think there's no doubt. I think on North Korea, no American president can make any kind of progress or inroads unless China and Russia also want there to be progress. So I think China and Russia are absolutely critical. And if the great powers, if the superpowers work together towards finding a solution is possible. North Korea is clearly very dependent on China and Russia. So without their kind of influence, it is impossible to find a solution.
All right. Okay, stay with us there, Professor Christian, please. And Dr. Leonid, thank you so much for the time you've taken out to give us your opinions. We are also going to be talking about another major event that has happened over the weekend. And this is essentially the story about foreign policy once again shifting from the U.S. point of view. The U.S. president, over the contentious S-400 purchase war that's been going on with Turkey, President Trump shifted gears from threatening Turkey with sanctions if it went ahead and bought the weapons from Russia to empathy, almost, what one could argue, saying that the fault was of former U.S. President Obama's for not allowing Ankara to buy their Patriot missiles in 2013. He said now they were looking at different solutions. The U.S. president also met with Turkish President Erdogan over the weekend, and President Trump says Washington would not impose sanctions on Ankara over the purchase of these Russia's S-400 systems. President Erdogan, on the other hand, has always been saying that he'll go ahead with the deal with Russia and that it has paid the total amount to the U.S. for the purchase of F-35, which is around $1.4 billion US. Now, these tensions have been going on between the NATO allies for a while, but now it seems the change in strategy has kind of cooled them down. But to find out more, we will be talking to our guests. We have with us from Istanbul, Egemen Bagis, a Turkish politician, and also we have Professor Christian still joining us on this show. Thank you so much. Mr. Bagis, I want to start with you and get your take on how you felt about this sudden shift of U.S. policy.
Well, actually, President Trump spoke the truth when he mentioned that during Obama administration, Turkey really tried to purchase the Patriot missiles. But Turkey was unfortunately refused. And we had no other option than looking for alternatives. First, we approached the Chinese technology, but we couldn't make a deal with them. And we ended up making a quite important deal with the Russian Federation. And they also provided us the financial credit to purchase the S-400. And we did. And all of the steps were shared publicly. It was transparent, so there was no hiding, nothing secret. All our NATO allies knew that Turkey was in the process of shopping for an air defense system and that Turkey was signing a deal. Only after it was signed and sealed and the payment terms were agreed upon, our allies started making some statements. But most importantly, the U.S. Officials, mainly from Pentagon, shared their unhappiness about our decision, but it was too late. And President Trump, during his press conference,
do you think it would have made any difference? Do you think it would have made any difference if he had come out, if the Pentagon had come out with its concerns before Turkey had signed with Russia?
Well, we would have taken it seriously and we would have discussed it, because their claims that it's going to interfere with NATO's defense system is not really accurate. I mean, after all, these are devices that can be programmed and everything is doable with technology. So if there's will, there's way. And our Russian friends are willing to cooperate with us.
Okay.
So we are willing to establish a committee of both Russia and U.S. and other NATO allies to make sure that this doesn't in any way threaten the security of NATO alliance, but at the same time provide the safety that Turkey requires.
Okay, but also, let me ask you this, Professor Christian. Do you agree that Trump was true in pointing out that it was Obama's administration's fault? But my question really is that wasn't this information always there? President Trump knew about it from the beginning when he started the protest to Turkey that don't go ahead and buy these.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, empirically, it is correct. The statement is correct. Obama did deny that purchase. But as you also pointed out, I mean, this information was always there. And again, this is classic Trump negotiation strategy. You first start threatening, then he realizes and accepts to an extent that those threats don't get anywhere with Turkey. So now there's a change of strategy, blaming Obama and kind of turning on the charm somewhat in the hope that he will get his objective. But let's not forget about it. If he's not achieving his objective, he will return to threats. And we will have this conversation again in a couple of months. Why is Trump suddenly starting to threaten again? I believe it's just a change in tactic, not a change in objective.
Strategy. Okay. So, Mr. Bagis, then let me ask you this. Then what has really changed between U.S. and Turkey, especially when there are sort of threats that President Trump is going to go back on his word? Does the military situation in Syria, the military positions, Turkey being under attack by the Syrian regime there in its outpost, does that have anything to do with the change in stance we're seeing from President Trump?
Well, Turkey's neighbors are not neighbors of Germany or Switzerland. And we do live in a very volatile region with neighbors like Iran, Syria, Iraq, Georgia, Armenia, Russia, Bulgaria. I mean, it's a very difficult neighborhood. So we do need the safety. And both our friends in Moscow and in Washington know that Turkey is very detrimental in ensuring peace and stability in the Middle East. But first, we have to protect ourselves before we can protect others. And I'm sure a solution will be found, and this crisis will be over very soon.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Bagis, joining us from Istanbul. Coming back to you, Professor Christian, there's also talk of developments in the Eastern Mediterranean where President Erdogan said that he talked to the U.S. President Donald Trump and said on the issue of Cyprus that the U.S. needs to not intervene, that it does not have the right to intervene. That's a pretty strong statement to make, don't you think?
Well, it's certainly a very strong statement because as we've seen with a lot of external actors being involved, whether that is the European Union, Britain, the United Nations, we still haven't found a solution, even though to an extent there has been political will on both sides. To an extent there hasn't been. So in a sense, to be suggesting that the United States shouldn't intervene is a very strong statement. Is it helpful for the United States to intervene? That is less clear because the kind of issues that are at stake and where there's disagreement, they're not easily solved. And we've been discussing them for decades now. But it's certainly a very clear signal of Turkey's intent to be a regional power. And I think that is what that statement really says.
Okay. So with that, I want to welcome another guest who's just joining, also from Istanbul, an analyst, Mr. Yusuf Erim. Welcome back to Newswire. We're talking about how President Trump's policy, as we all know it, is at best very unpredictable, and how we've seen him change gears over the S-400 issue with Turkey. What is your take on it? What could be the reason essentially behind this shift?
Well, when we have to remember Turkey's an important ally to the United States, and Turkey has very valid arguments when it comes to the S-400. We heard many of those valid arguments from President Trump and President Erdogan's press conference together. Now, when we look at what could happen going forward, there's opportunities for Turkey to be able to evade sanctions. We have to remember that when Turkey signed the S-400 deal, it did this before U.S. Congress enacted CAATSA. So for CAATSA to be retroactively used against Turkey, there's no legal basis behind this. Now, there's also many hotspots right now in the Middle East, whether it be the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it be Syria, whether it be Iraq, whether it be Iran. These These are all areas that are very important to the United States where Turkey could be a very valuable ally. It's not worth losing Turkey over the S-400, and I believe President Trump realizes that.
But why is it that the realization, sorry to cut you there, but why is it that the realization always comes so late? It took President Erdogan's statement that there's nothing we're going to change in, we are going to move forward with our deal with the S-400s. Why is it, I mean, this information was there before, essentially.
This is the way I look at it. Now, you have to look at the U.S. Political makeup. You have Congress on one side, you have the President, you have the State Department, you have many institutions, and unfortunately, during President Trump's administration, these institutions were not working very cohesively together. We can see this from the change 3 times in Pentagon chiefs. You had Mattis, and now you have Esper, and the Pentagon chief has changed 3 times. You've had Pompeo at State. You had Tillerson at State. I mean, people are constantly changing. Their beliefs are constantly changing. And there's checks and balances in the U.S. The president is not the final authority on everything, regardless of even the promises that he's made while he was here. And the positive rhetoric does not even necessarily mean that he can deliver on these things when he gets back to Washington. All it means is the U.S.-Turkey relationship is looking better today than it was tomorrow. But we're going to have to see what happens after the S-400s are delivered before we can say Turkey is out of the woods.
You mean the F-35s?
No, the S-400.
So so there is still doubt whether they will, the U.S. will go ahead with the delivery of the F-35s?
The F-35 is very important for Turkey.
Right.
It's a jet that Turkey wants to buy. The capabilities are important for Turkey. Now, the U.S. is claiming that the S-400 can compromise the F-35 stealth technology. But Turkey's countering this claim by saying, hey, let's sit down, let's have a working group, let's bring my best engineers, you bring your best engineers. Hey, let's even invite NATO's engineers. Let them work together and show you that we can protect this technology. Now, even when President Trump was talking at the presser next to President Erdogan, he said that in Turkey's view, they're compatible, but in our view, mentioning the United States, they're incompatible. So there's even a slight admission there that the F-35 and the S-400 can be compatible, where they can share the same territory without compromising this type of technology. Now, what type of compromise is going to be reached between these two countries, that remains to be seen. But like I said again, with the S-400, it's looking better today than it was tomorrow.
It's looking better today. So there is some kind of room for negotiation here. Professor, coming back to you, Professor Christian, how we heard our guest here talking about that there seems to be a negotiation sort of moving forward. Is that your perception also, that they will eventually come to the table and the delivery of the F-35s won't be scrapped as it was initially thought to be?
Yep. I think that's completely possible. I mean, there's clearly a negotiation going on. There was always going to be a negotiation going on because, of course, Turkey, as the previous speaker pointed out, is a vital ally for the United States. Will there be an agreement? Well, I think it will ultimately depend on what Turkey decides on the S-400. If it absolutely goes ahead, I think things will become more complicated. I think Trump, even if he wants to be accommodating, has certain limits to what he can be accommodating about. And then I think if it goes forward, there aren't many defense analysts in the United States who think that would be a good idea for Turkey. So I think very clearly if that goes ahead, there's going to be trouble later. But at the moment, there's an attempt of a negotiation, there's a charm offensive, and I think there's the hope that America can achieve something by negotiating with President Erdogan.
So, Yusuf, now there's also the statement that's just come in that within 10 days, the S-400s will be delivered. And let's talk a little about in terms of the issues that have been always there between Erdogan and President Trump, or whether it's over the matter of Israel-Palestine conflict, or it's a matter of Eastern Mediterranean issues there, and several others. What do you think, historically, learning from how they've dealt with this, will they be moving forward?
Well, there's many issues between Turkey and the United States, but I wouldn't call these issues between Erdogan and Trump. I would call these more issues between Erdogan and Obama that Trump inherited. Now, when you look at the decision to work with the YPG in Syria, the YPG, the Syrian affiliate of a designated terror group, the PKK, this happened on Obama's watch. We look at the decision to grant asylum to the mastermind of the coup attempt in Turkey, Fethullah Gulen. That happened back in, I believe it was 1999 when this happened. So these are problems that Trump has inherited from previous administrations. I mean, President Trump and Erdogan seem to have a very good relationship when they get together. There's always positive rhetoric coming out. Now, is this the standard diplomatic talk between two leaders? Well, that remains to be seen. Of course, we have to see how Trump will follow up on what he said. But we see an understanding. We see an understanding that the S-400, the whole way the S-400 mess, as he called it, transpired. We see that Turkey tried to buy Patriots, he says. Obama constantly blocked them. And he recognizes this was a national security concern for Turkey, and Turkey had to buy air defense to protect itself from ballistic attacks. In the end, this is a NATO country. It has to protect itself. Protecting itself is not only important for itself, it's important for NATO. So, like I said, we're going to have to see how it goes forward. I mean, there was a roadmap, obviously, for Manbij that was never properly implemented. So we've seen promises made and unkept during the Trump administration as well. But I'm cautiously optimistic on the S-400 that these two leaders will be able to find a way to work it out.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yusuf Erim, and also Professor Christian, for giving us your time here. It's time now for us to take a quick break. We will be right back. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, we've been talking in this episode a lot about U.S. foreign policy under President Donald Trump and how it has changed, almost shifted gears in certain issues in the past few years. And once again, we're bringing up another story where we see the same commonality. Here, President Donald Trump, on the sidelines of the G20 summit, has called a decades-old U.S.-Japan security treaty to be unfair to the U.S., and he wants changes in it. And this could complicate relations with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's drive to revise Japan's pacifist constitution, and also might bring some unwanted hindrances between the relationship between the two, which has largely been pretty well. Now, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, this was signed way back between the United States and Japan, giving the U.S. essentially the right to use Japan's land for military bases. The treaty also stated that Japan would not have its own military, and in exchange, U.S. promised to defend Japan in the event of an attack. So what is now going on with the treaty that the U.S. finds very unfair? To understand what this means to not just the relationship, but at a time where there's already so much on the plate of President Trump in terms of international relations and the conflicts that's embroiled in, we would like to welcome our guests to speak on this. First on the panel, we have Mr. Ross Feingold. He's a political risk analyst joining us from Taipei. Welcome, Mr. Ross, to the show. So in this latest move, could this mean that both the countries have been sitting on a treaty that has been negatively affecting the U.S. all this time?
Well, obviously, the United States has benefited tremendously from this treaty and from having access to bases throughout Japan, including in Okinawa, which is often very controversial because many of the residents oppose those bases. But it has allowed the United States to project power in East Asia. It has assisted in protecting other treaty allies, such as South Korea, where the U.S. also has bases, but the bases and the naval presence in Japan augment the presence in South Korea. And it also allows the United States to project power towards the South China Sea, which in recent years has become a very controversial area given China's rather expansive sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. So clearly the United States has benefited from the structure of the treaty. But it's also fair to question whether revisions are necessary or whether it's too one-sided. And that's probably what got Donald Trump's attention when President Trump was told that this defense assistance obligation is a bit one-sided in the sense that the U.S. would come to defend Japan, but Japan is not obligated to actually defend the United States.
Mm-hmm. But isn't this something that in the beginning, when the treaty was signed, everyone was pretty much aware of, considering Japan's pacifist sort of approach to this, that they wouldn't take it to war, they wouldn't pick up arms? Why would he bring it up right now? What do you make of the timing?
Yeah, that's the important point, though. The structure of the agreement worked at the time. It was in the decades after World War II. As you mentioned earlier, there was an initial version of the treaty, and subsequently it was revised. But it's now over 50 years. And this is actually the interesting point, is Shinzo Abe has also been calling for revisions to the pacifist constitution. He is interested in Japan having the ability to project its power abroad and not just serve as a self-defense force, as it's officially known, and for Japan to play a role in international security that's really commensurate with the size of its economy and the role that Japan otherwise plays in multilateral institutions. So from that perspective, actually, Donald Trump's comments are fairly consistent with the goals of Japan's prime minister. It's only a lot of critics of President Trump, some media, who are saying, wow, how could you criticize this treaty? But again, it's fair to ask, this many decades after the treaty was signed, whether or not it's time to revise it and actually to enshrine a greater obligation for Japan.
But then does Japan have that much to offer where President Trump would question that why is it not an equal give and take in terms of if it needs Japan's on the forefront as its ally?
Well, even though they're called the self-defense forces, the reality is Japan does spend a reasonable, more than a reasonable amount on its defense compared to some of its neighbors, or as measured as a percentage of its GDP. And again, Shinzo Abe has been very committed to improving the posture of Japan's defense forces. Mm-hmm. So they certainly have been investing in equipment. They're investing in additional capabilities, whether it's in the air or on the sea. So it would be unfair to say they don't have anything to offer as far as engaging in hostilities or in defensive actions or coming to the aid of the United States. I mean, they are very well trained. They have very close cooperation with the United States, frequent exercises, for example. So this is a very effective fighting force, actually.
Okay. And another point that President Trump raised was that anybody who had the privilege of getting Washington's protection should also pay up in kind.
Well, that always is a bit of a complex formula, because we have to also consider the subsidies that go towards the bases, whether it's South Korea that pays a portion of the U.S. base presence in South Korea, or Japan, which pays a portion towards the cost of U.S. bases in Japan, or they're paying the cost to shift the bases in Okinawa, which again has been a very controversial issue with the population and the residents there. But certainly Japan does pay a lot, and also Japan does purchase a large amount of U.S. military equipment as well. So it wouldn't be accurate to say that they are freeloading off of the United States. But again, when it comes to multilateral security matters or assistance to U.S. efforts in other parts of the world, I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, Japan should behave like a mature member of international society and as an ally of the United States.
So what would happen, in your opinion, if, say, the treaty ended and negotiations between the two couldn't be agreed upon?
It's not likely that the treaty is going to end. I mean, it's more likely that Japan is going to have some very difficult domestic political discussions. And that goes hand in hand with whether or not to make revisions to the Constitution. So this is not the first time that a Japanese prime minister in recent decades has said, let's look at this. Maybe it's time for us to change this. And even if he commands a large majority in the Japanese parliament, there's always some members of his own party who might get nervous about this. The opposition, although they're small, they might oppose this. And members of the public might actually get more enthusiastic about opposing changes to the Constitution. And again, that would make it difficult to change the nature of the treaty with the United States.
And also there is this, the latest in this conference where these statements were made, we heard Prime Minister Abe come out and say this treaty was not under review, while Donald Trump was of the opinion that he will have to change it.
Well, again, it's unlikely that there's any imminent changes to the treaty because so much would depend on whether or not Japan's constitution will be changed and what kind of political support there is. And frankly, Shinzo Abe needs more broad political support domestically in Japan before he could change the wording of the Constitution, let alone the mutual security agreement with the United States.
And he has continuously over the years increased Japan's defense budget, but at the same time, it seems to be a very tough battle for him to convince the government to get on his side to make these kind of amendments.
Well, the challenge for a Japanese prime minister, whether it's the current prime minister or the past or in the future, is to say, and again, to convince the public and politicians broadly, not just in his own party, but the opposition as well, that defense spending is not only with North Korea or China in mind, but that actually defense spending means, again, as I said earlier, being a member of the international society and allied with the Western powers, whether it's the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, in periodically taking collective action as well, whether that's the war on terror, anti-piracy actions off the coast of Africa, even joining in disaster relief, which requires a military capability to execute such operations. So it's repeatedly been a very tough sell when it comes to defense issues, not just to increase the budget, but when you do so to say it's not only for North Korea threat or China threat, but there's actually broader issues we need to consider as a member of the international community.
All right. Thank you so much. We were talking to Mr. Ross Feingold. Now we're joined by Professor Elizabeth Freund Larus, an international relations expert from Poland. Welcome to Newswire. Professor Elizabeth, we are trying to investigate here and wrap our heads around not just President Trump's approach to foreign policy. Here again with Japan, he has shown sort of resentment towards the peace treaty, and then when confronted about it, said he had no issue. And now on the sidelines of G20, he's come out clean saying it's unfair. What do you make of his policy?
Well, his comments are very interesting because we honestly do have a rather curious mutual defense alliance with Japan, where the United States, of course, must come to Japan's defense. But Japan, because of Article 9 of its pacifist constitution, is very limited in what it can do in response to helping the United States, defend the United States. And so President Trump, he's not a man that has a background in foreign policy. And so when he hears that our mutual defense treaty is not quite mutual, he's confused. And then he says, well, that's not fair. So on its face, it appears not fair. But then you have to understand the history of the region, that the other countries in the region are still very afraid of a remilitarized, a so-called normal Japan with a strong military. So honestly, President Trump does not have this background in foreign policy. He hears things and he speaks off the cuff very, very quickly. And so I would not put so much stock on his, in English we say, off-the-cuff comments, his immediate responses. That is, let's wait.
So one of the issues that President Trump has raised is that Japan must pay even more for the privilege of having Washington's protection. What do you make of that, since Tokyo's already paid in 2017 about 84% of the cost of hosting them in their bases?
Yeah, again, I don't think President Trump really is aware of how much Japan pays to host U.S. forces. And I suspect that once people fill him in, then you won't see so many of these comments anymore.
Also, Professor, it's really interesting the timing of it all. He chose the sidelines of the G20 summit to bring this up already. The world was watching how things would unfold with him and President Xi, and then also with North Korea's denuclearization campaign going on. What do you make of this timing?
Well, I believe that it came up in a press conference. I don't know if he was prepared to make these comments. I mean, these comments are somewhat consistent with his view of America first. If he feels that a deal has been made that is not good for the United States, he's going to rethink it. So on the surface, some of these deals seem like they're not so good for the United States. But when we dig deeper and we find out why these deals were made, how they were made, then I think that he will have a better understanding. And President Trump is not an Asianist. He has not studied U.S.-Asia foreign policy. So sometimes when he hears these things, it's relatively new to him. And then when he gets more information practiced in the area, then I think we will see a better understanding.
But what's your understanding of the treaty that's lasted over 60 years so far? Do you think that it doesn't help the United States at all? It's more of a cost than a benefit here? No. But even the Japanese, even Prime Minister Abe is reconsidering. Prime Minister Abe has made many comments about beefing up the Japanese military because it is rather limited. However, the United States and Japan about 2-3 years ago did discuss a wider geographical range for the Japanese military. And that is, it used to be that if the U.S. were attacked in the area of Japan, that Japan would come to a certain amount of U.S. defense. But now there is a much broader range that Japan said it would come to U.S. defense in a much further, an area much further afield. So there has been that progress. And so, no, I would disagree that this has been a bad deal for the United States. The Japanese military is nothing to be scoffed at. And it definitely lends what's called power aggregation to U.S. forces in the area. So we don't need Japan to meet the United States one-on-one, militarily wise, in the Asia-Pacific. But physically, its assets are there that can be called upon to help out. Okay, so then it forces me to ask the next question, which really is that 2020 election campaign is already underway for President Trump. He has been campaigning and pretty much won the last time on the basis of America first. Do you think this has also something to do with it, to have brought this up at this point?
Very possibly, but I'm sure you and the audience have heard the term that all politics are local. And so in presidential elections and on the campaign, most of the rhetoric concerns domestic policy. And so that's where he's going to put much of his focus. And to be honest, much of the United States likes Japan. We don't have a problem with Japan. And so he's not going to raise this issue that much on the campaign trail, not the way in, the last election. It was China. So, yeah, it's possible that this is part of campaign rhetoric. I think it's more so he's in the region. People asked him questions. He was responding. And so I don't think that his comments at G20 regarding Japan are a major component of his campaign. I think it was in response to questions that were given to him at that time, at that place. And I don't think he's going to return to this issue much in the 2020 campaign.
He's not going to return much to this issue. Thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth, for taking out the time and talking about the latest developments between President Trump and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on the issue of the peace security treaty between the two. And with that, we've run out of time here on Newswire. We will be meeting you again tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.